We're going to discuss whether detection is very important for zero trust in this paradigm. We have been talking about how important is identity throughout the whole day, but we say identity is the new perimeter. But obviously, a lot of this automation orchestration relies on heavily in detection, having a strong detection across different platforms, but definitely on the network as well. So we have Nick Hunter with us. He's a senior technical product manager at Corelight, and with over 15 years of experience in a wide range of cybersecurity roles, including 8 years of security operations experience. So he's going to talk to us about, can you trust your zero trust with only privileged access security? So we'll pay attention to you, Nick. Nick, we cannot hear you. We see the slides, but
Sorry about that. Thank you, everyone.
oh, no problem. We can hear
Sometimes,
you and see you now.
yeah, it's the first time doing a Zoom panelist, so
Very
this
good.
is a fun experience, and hopefully everybody's having a great day and enjoying all the panels today. I think they've been fantastic, and following the act of Google Cloud is certainly going to be a challenge, but hopefully you get something out of this, and we all have learned something today. So go ahead and try and take over the slide deck here. There we go. My name is Nick Hunter. I am a senior technical marketing manager at Corelight. My background, I spent 7 or 8 years in a SOC, a very dark room in the basement of a building in Alexandria, Virginia. Being in a SOC, you get a great amount of experience with not just a particular type of log type or a security platform, but you get exposure to the whole stack. And so, I've gotten quite a bit of experience with NDR, PAM, and identity access management since I've left the SOC, and I joined Corelight in 2021. And so that's what I'm going to kind of talk to you about today, is the network visibility that's required to verify and trust, implement zero trust and validate everything that's going on, and making sure that you're enforcing your policies and the just-in-time access beyond just going through a PAM or a privileged access solution. So for agenda, so what I'm going to cover is the maneuver space, and I'll go into more detail about what that means. But maneuver space, just to give you a hint, is absolutely appreciated by adversaries. So they're very comfortable with the more space you give them. And to solve that problem, there's certainly not a solution. And I think that's not a surprise to anybody, but if it is, I can tell you why that's, you should be, there's not a single solution out there. And then I'll kind of go into a demonstration of how you can apply a strategy to secure zero trust. And actually, without a solution, you need a strategy and you need a program, and you need a enforcement of that program. And a lot of the panelists have talked about many different ways, and there's absolutely not a single one solution that can solve this problem. So we'll talk strategy more than a solution today. So maneuver is destiny. And what does that mean? So what is the maneuver space? Maneuver space is where the adversary likes to sit. The more space you give them, the more space they have to hide and carry out their whatever goals that they've set, whatever their intentions are. The more space you give them, the more likely that success chance increases. Prevention eventually fails. And it's inside the network, it becomes even harder to have prevention, because business continuity and network operations takes precedence. Anytime you put security measures in, and I don't know if I'm sure there's some people that have sat on in the security operations team, and I'm sure there's people that sit on the network operations team. That collaboration, at least in my experience, it can be stressful and can be have some challenges because security is all about trying to implement controls and enforcement and protecting the network, while the network operations team is all about the continuity. And while I have a lot of friends that sat on the network operations team, being in the SOC, you're trying to do what you can to protect your clients, your business, your name, your reputation. And a lot of times those, working with the NOC and the network operations teams, that becomes a grind, trying to figure out how you can work together and balance that relationship. And from a defender space, the maneuver volume is about trying to shrink that maneuver volume of the adversary. And comparatively, that strategy is very scattered because you've got all these different stacks of solution that you've put in place that make it very difficult to measure and figure out, okay, how much space and how much maneuver am I actually providing with this stack? When you work and you try and secure everything and you try and lock down and you implement privileged access and just-in-time access, you're really shrinking that maneuverability, specifically on the endpoint. But then there's quite a bit of, what else are you doing that's reducing that maneuverability and that space for the adversary to work outside of that endpoint protection. So what I did here is I took a visualization of all of the network IP addresses on a network prior to the COVID pandemic that's taken. And so this is before the shift to remote access and remote workforce. And what this visualization is showing here is this is all highlighting all in different colors, represent different types of systems and architectures and services and endpoints and file servers and IoT devices that sit within the network. And when you're protecting the endpoint, as you can see, some of these, with a remote workforce, and you've got people in your branch office, these IP addresses, endpoint protection, you clearly can identify this adversary that's sitting out there because he's trying to break in at the endpoint layer. EDR, privilege access management, and privilege, like the access management security solutions that sit on the endpoint, you can actually protect when you're just looking at the endpoint part of the picture. With the transition to cloud, with the transition to the remote workforce, what you're looking at now is you've got the coverage and the maneuverability space of the network now. And with the remote workforce, you see that this picture becomes quite a bit more congested with all this network services and traffic, VPN connectivity into the office. That has provided these adversaries so much more space to work with, because once they can get past that endpoint, once they get into the network, and because these endpoints and because of the transition to the remote workforce, the perimeter, as we've heard just a moment ago, has completely disappeared. It is what shifted. It is dramatically shifted and opened up because you've got the cloud resources, you've got the shift to the cloud, but then you've got all these endpoints and VPNs and remote services taking place. That adversary has so many more opportunities to get inside the network. And once he's inside the network, it's very, very hard to discover because of that maneuverability space that they have. And let's click through this one. A little latency on the slide. So earlier this year, the NIST publication 800-207 came out, and this was all about zero trust. And what it talks about is that zero trust solution that used to be solved by the endpoint security has now shifted, and absolutely and they recognize you need visibility in the network. When your logs and your events and your security monitoring is coming from the endpoint, and you have those logs on the endpoint, and you've got that complete visibility in the endpoint, you're very secure until that endpoint and that access has now been compromised and a breach has taken place, and the adversary is now on the network. But what this also means is, how do you verify? How do you ensure that those protections that you've put in place with the EDR, with the SOC triad, are effective? Because you need the visibility, and that's not an IDS, and that's not NetFlow. That is passive monitoring of the network that can't be altered or changed in any way. So passive monitoring is that visibility, and that visibility is being able to monitor the network passively without slowing down network traffic, without creating more noise for the SOC, without creating more events and incidents that that are either misclassified or not able to be validated. You've got your endpoint monitoring, you've got your endpoint logs. You need the network visibility that complements those logs to validate and ensure that those protections you've put on place in the endpoint, and then also throughout the rest of your security stack, are also effective. So some basic maneuvers that you can start off with, having been in the SOC, you really want to make sure that the SOC environment is encouraging mentoring and rewards curiosity and camaraderie between the teams. You want to develop policies that enforce and validate least privilege. You want to encourage the collaboration between the SOC and the NOC. You want to implement NIST security handling and NIST ITIL management practices. Absolutely important when you do it that way, because what that does is that puts procedures and policies in place that govern what the analysts and what your SOC teams are looking at, and they measure it, and they can hand off and use the workflows that those policies and those frameworks focus on, so that you're actually able to move and provide the proper incident reviews, incident management life cycles that you need for incident response. And then you're only focusing on true incidents, true high severity incidents, and your IR teams can go out and respond to any type of threats and possible breaches and contain those effectively in a matter of time. And then while that's all going on, you also want to have continuous hunts. This is where user behavior analytics come in, and machine learning and AI, because you have analysts from the human that are looking at the logs and the events and creating incidents and doing the incident lifecycle management. But you also need machines doing that now, because you don't have the resources and the expertise needed, and it's hard to keep that in the SOC when all of this activity is taking place and all of these more noise and false positives are taking the time of the humans. If you can start to filter that down and reduce that noise through machine learning and analytic and monitoring and analysis, you can start to filter out and just focus on just the incidents and security threats that are most validated for your human analysts to look at. And then what I'm going to talk about next in these coming slides is what kind of practice can you put in place that can make sure that you're securing your endpoints, securing your zero trust policies, and enforcing least privilege and just-in-time access. So what that means is you create and replicate the current state of your environment as best that you can. So this is your blue team, red team activities. You create that model, you continually practice attacks and threats, and you keep them current and relevant. You keep testing and you validate, and you make sure that when you see an attack or a breach and you see that activity at the endpoint, that you're able to correlate that with what you see on the network and what you see with the rest of your security stack. And you learn from that and you improve. You make sure that you keep checking those boxes, that as the different strategies and the different scenarios that take place, adversaries becoming more sophisticated with their attacks, you want to make sure that when those new types of tactics that they're using, that you're able to check the box and say, okay, EDR saw that. EDR maybe didn't see that. What did the network see that? Does it show up in our SIM? What other tools do we have that can detect that? And you just want to see and check those boxes and always be monitoring and practicing and validating and then learning from those exercises and improving your security program from that. So I talked about not having a solution earlier, and there really isn't one. But there you can do, and this shouldn't be new, but this is a layered validated privilege access approach of validating just-in-time access through a segmented, micro-segmented, macro-segmented network validation layer. So what you're doing here at this connection layer is you're validating in things with zero trust network awareness or network monitoring, and using CASBs and proxies to limit just-in-time asset and implementing role-based access controls. If you correlate that correctly with your EDR at the validation level, your networks, your firewalls, your proxy logs, and you're doing that in correlation and providing that information at the SIM layer, doing your analytics at the SIM layer, you then have the proper investigation layer where security operations and incident response teams can really focus on true positives and focus out all of that noise, all of that distraction, and really validate whether or not that zero trust program is being enforced. Because zero trust is all about trust is the trust nobody, assume everybody's an adversary, but then you have to validate that, because if you once you've realized that that person has gotten, or that adversary has gotten on the network because you trusted them to be who they thought they were, that they were a trusted user, now they have access, and you have to be able to validate, okay, well, how else can we detect a trusted user is accessing and is really who they are? And the only way you can do that is through correlation of all of these different logs, and specifically network visibility, to see where they're going on the network. And that's where the SOC triad comes in with the layered privilege strategy. So when you look at this log correlation, you've got EDR, you've got NDR, and then you've got privilege access. Privilege access controls the endpoint. But once you're past the endpoint, what happens? How do you monitor those activities? And IDS is going to tell you a point in time. I saw something bad. I see something, what I've been trained to look at. But then you have, how do you do passive monitoring? NetFlow only gives you a small, usually in segments of, 5-minute samples. Full PCAP monitoring is, not only is it, require a tremendous amount of logging and storage requirements, and there's a cost to that, but it's also only giving you again, a moment in time, because you're not able to do full-time PCAP monitoring, and you're not able to do one-click access inside of your SIM. So it doesn't get correlated. You have to go look for that PCAP. You need to pull it up and say, okay, well, I saw some activity. Let me go get the PCAP. It's not there as part of your incident response, and it's very hard to correlate that. So the SOC triad layered with your zero trust initiatives using privilege access is probably the best strategy going forward. And I kind of can demonstrate that through some proof of concept here. So this is a concept strategy that you could apply to any type of foundation. The one I focused on here was the zero trust M2131 coverage map, and that's this map here. And so what I did was I looked at these pillars and I scored them based on specifically the capabilities associated with each of the different types of the security stack. And this is something you can do. So when you're doing your mapping and when you're doing your exercise of practice, you go back to this scorecard and you apply weighting to it. So for EDR, for example, if you look at EDR, I assign those for the first two columns of user and device. And you've got one box for privilege access management, which is your PAM box. And then you've got EDR, which is at the device level, authentication, authorization, and compliance. And they're also validating user and authentication and authorization in some cases. And so you put a weight on that score here. And then let's look at privilege access, because it's only one box, the weighting is a little bit lower. And when you look at SIM is accounted for under visibility analytics in one box. But when you look at network, very different than EDR and privilege access and SIM, it's got its own pillar. And that pillar applies to many different boxes. And you see the blue lines down below, you've got visibility and analytics. Well, that's coming from PAM, that's coming from EDR, it's coming from network. That applies to everything, and it's all being accounted for in this SIM box over here in this column. But network defined 1, 2, 3, 4 different boxes. You've got the encryption layer, so the weighting is much higher on the network side. So how do you apply this strategy? When you look at the violations, if you were to take out privilege access, for example, you look at the maneuver space over here. This maneuver space, if all of this were, if everything was working and your logs were able to detect everything, you'd have a 100% on the defender side. Roundabout. There's obviously always going to be some gaps because of just the way the practices go. But you're feeling that your defensive maneuverability that you've contained is around 100%. But when you start taking things when you're doing your exercises and you're practicing, and you see that for some reason privilege access has not logged that violation, that adversary has gotten past in your exercise the endpoint or the privilege access controls. Well, what's happened now is that means that attacker now has a 17% increase in maneuver space. You're still feeling pretty good because you're at an 83% defender maneuver space. That's a pretty good containment. Let's take a look at SIM. SIM being at with a weighting of about 17%. If your SIM for some reason doesn't correlate that activity and present it to an analyst, you're still at 83%, and you're only giving the adversary a 17% maneuverability. Still, you're feeling pretty good. When you look at NDR, though, you're looking at a 27% maneuver space. You're at 73%, because this NDR covers so much areas, as we looked at the map earlier, 27%, it's not a terrible situation, but it's certainly much more increased, and there's a lot more maneuver space for that adversary to work with. But what happens when you don't have NDR? Let's just say that you're looking at the SOC triad and you've invested in EDR, you've invested in PAM, and you've invested in the SIM. If that EDR violation fails and you're not able to detect it, and you don't have NDR, suddenly that maneuver space significantly drops for the defensive side, and the advantage is now on the adversarial side. That's a 51% to 49% difference in maneuver space. That's why it's so critical to make sure you have the complete SOC triad and that you're able to practice these exercises, which is even more important because NDR may not detect it, EDR may detect it, privilege access may detect it, and those logs all filter into that SIM. So that SIM, if that's not tuned and doing the proper correlations, that might not detect it. And so this is why that strategy, there's no one solution. It takes multiple solutions, multiple platforms all working together and correlated to produce a proper and reduce that maneuver space of the adversary. So let's take a look at it with privilege access. Again, the same strategy applies. NDR, 27%. If you don't have NDR and you don't have privilege access, like that coverage and that advantage that you have is dramatically reduced without NDR. You may have the privilege access solution as we looked at before. You're still feeling pretty good if you've got NDR in place. You don't have NDR, drops down to 56%. That visibility of the network is incredibly important. SIM, again, same scenario here. You have EDR, you've got privilege access, but what if your SIM isn't tuned right? What if your SIM is creating a lot of noise or false positives? I know when I was in the SOC, what happened was we would have incidents that would just sit there and we just didn't pay attention to them because they just kept appearing and they just kept appearing and they kept appearing, and they were low severity because we didn't have our correlation set up correctly. And so, when I was in the SOC, NDR was an IDS. And when we were correlating those three things together, if it wasn't tuned right, this severity level would show up as a warning or even a critical, but it never reached the scope of having our IR team actually go out and do a containment activity because we didn't have the right correlation in place, and it wasn't telling us that, hey, this severity of the adversary coming through the EDR platform or coming through the privilege access platform, getting past those controls, if it's not correlated correctly, it's not going to give us the right severity. And those logs, sometimes you turn off a firewall log because it just creates too much noise and because you can't store that and it doesn't matter to your compliance or your regulation. So you just turn it off. It's really, it's causing a lot more of a problem. Well, what happens when you turn it off? You lose that visibility. And when you don't have it correlated and it's tuned out at the SIM level, again, you're missing the part of that picture. And what we're showing that when you don't have that part of the picture, you lose that advantage of coverage. And the adversary has so much more maneuverability space. If you'd like to learn more about NDR or Corelight, I'll be in the Slack channel. Be happy to talk to you there. But that's what I have today, and I hope you've gotten something out of just the strategy and what you've learned taking a look at my presentation today. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Nick. I really enjoyed your talk and your approach on how to calculate the density of these different solutions in the DISA maturity model. That was very very interesting. Now I have a question for you. We've talked about automation quite a lot, right? And we're talking about how you can implement these zero trust concepts in the SOC. How do you see, what's the role of these type of solutions, specifically NDR, when it comes to orchestrating responses, maybe providing analytics based on that, trying to determine what normal looks like. Some other previous speakers talked about discovering flows, and how can that help on the discovery phase and also on the variable trust piece for orchestrating responses fast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I have a pretty good background in ITIL, and one of the things that you try and practice is you really want to really want to focus on being able to isolate and identify what's real and what's not real, and going through that incident life cycle of correlating different events, different alerts. And when you have automation in place and you have things with machine learning that's feeding that automation, and you're making it smarter and you're making it continuously improved, what that does is that improves the maturity model of your incident management lifecycle program. So going a little more deeper than that, let's say, for example, that you're seeing network behavior activity where you're looking at a normalized behavior of active business hours. You're seeing these events come in. You're able to start seeing this user logs in at this time at this time from this end this IP address, and they connect to servers using the same SSH key or an SSH key, and they're doing their work and their activities. Well, you start to normalize that behavior, and you create a pattern. That pattern, through that UBA or from their access logs, starts to create a big picture, a better picture, and a clearer picture, and that starts to feed the automation and the learning that goes on in behind that automation, and it starts to feed correlation, and that correlation starts to get smarter and smarter, and it starts to reduce the noise, and it gets you closer to having true positives. True positives are what feeds and strengthens the maneuverability of defenses of the SOC.
I really like that response, Nick. Good example of how something that may not be like super revolutionary new technology, but used in the right way can help us to implement these zero trust concepts.
Yeah,
Very
it used to
insightful.
always be a human. I'm sorry, just real fast. It used
Yeah,
to always
go
be a
ahead.
human that had to do that. But now, as the machines are doing that and taking that place, humans can focus more on looking at what the machines produce. What does that analytics produce? What does that pattern produce? They can focus on that and leave that up to the machines, who can do some of that pattern matching. But it still takes validation and tuning and constant evaluation of that tuning to make sure it's accurate and current.
Exactly, and that allows humans to do more like high cognitive tasks, which is essentially what we should be doing in the SOC.
Absolutely.